Welcome, everyone. I'm Johanna Gibson. I'm actually a professor of intellectual property law at Queen Mary, but I am also the convener of animal law at Queen Mary in the Centre for Commercial Law Studies. So I have two postgraduate modules in animal law and a couple of very talented PhD students. And I have a particular passion for teaching the impact of the animals on the law and the impact of law on animals, and looking at intersections between animal law and commercial law in particular. And I'm very excited to have Caroline here. We first met because we met through her amazing PhD research, which I learned a tremendous amount from, and was very happy to incorporate also in with, of course, attributing you, Caroline, into the work that I do in one of my modules in wildlife trade, because of course there's an amazing intersection of issues here. We have the cultural sector, we have the impact on animal welfare, on research, on actual innovation industries as well, and also of course in looking at heritage and looking at how we deal with items, aesthetic items, and in some respects, even as I was speaking to students today, interactions with fashion and collections. So it really is an amazing topic to bring together so many issues into one discussion. Caroline is, of course, senior lecturer at Portsmouth University in the law school, and she's also the leader of the Ivory project at Portsmouth. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from her today as well on that project. It's really an incredible piece of research and an incredible piece of advocacy as well, I would say, in the sense that it is really widening people's understanding of the issues at stake and really putting things in a context that perhaps hasn't always been the approach in this kind of work. So I'm very much looking forward to today. I won't take up too much time. I would prefer to hand over to Caroline and to listen to her incredible presentation, Ice Ivory to White Gold, Links Between the Illegal Wildlife Trade and the Trade in Geocultural Artifacts. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you for everyone who's joined us this afternoon. It's so kind of you to give up a couple of hours of your afternoon to come and listen. So as Jo mentioned, my whole academic career has been based around elephant ivory, and I've got a lovely picture on the screen right now of a rather grand and handsome African elephant walking through the savannah there. But today, what we're going to be talking about is how the terrible, destructive and evil trade in elephant ivory has almost brought elephants to the brink of extinction. And we're going to be mirroring that against another animal. Some of you guys will only know this animal from Disney, or I think it was Disney, it might have been Pixar, I'm sorry if I got it wrong, the mammoth, the woolly mammoth. And the reason, of course, is the tusk of the woolly mammoth is very similar in lots of ways to elephant ivory. So we're going to be looking at these two species, one extinct, one on the very brink of extinction, and thinking about the ways that the illegal wildlife trade, the illegal trade in ivory, can be mirrored in the trade in geocultural artifacts, i.e. mammoth ivory tusks. So Jo very kindly mentioned when she was introducing me the Ivory project at the University of Portsmouth, and the project started in 2016, when really it was when I started thinking, oh gracious, I should really pull my finger out and do a PhD. And my lovely supporter and second supervisor sat me down. He said, well, what are you going to do it on? You know, you're a lawyer, maybe, you know, something to do with equity and trusts. I didn't want to do equity and trusts. Maybe something to do with contract law. I didn't really want to do anything to do with contract law either. And I said, what about the illegal wildlife trade? And he said, okay, we haven't got anyone doing anything like that. Let's go for the illegal wildlife trade. So that started what's become a life's work for me. A little bit later on, I'm going to be telling you about how I first fell in love with African elephants. But when I started the Ivory project, I think I was like most people who think about elephants. They're majestic, they're strong, they're astounding creatures, these massive animals that roam thousands of miles a year across the southern African range states. I was blown away by the animal. But I had to think about the cultural property side of the elephant ivory trade if I was really going to do the Ivory project justice. And so I came up to London to meet with a jeweler, and she said, where would you like to meet? And I said, you know what, I want to go to the V&A. I'd like you to show me the stuff that you say makes ivory so important. Take me to the V&A and show it to me. So I got this amazing tour of the Victoria and Albert Museum from a very well-known British jeweler. And she showed me ivory that had been used by Coco Chanel in her jewelry, lots of different important, incredible things. And there I have this juxtaposition. So I've got my beloved elephant on the one side, being hunted to the brink of extinction. And I've got these items that there is no doubt are culturally very, very important on the other. And so for the Ivory project, we kind of had to bring those two together and not look at one without the other. It simply wasn't possible to do that. So the Ivory project later on did some work with the British government, and we're working behind the scenes with the British government, advising them on the trade in ivory in the UK in what led up to the Ivory Bill, now hurrah, the Ivory Act. And the Ivory Act came into force in the UK on the 6th of June this year. Only took 4 years to get it there, but we did it in the end. So the project's been a really important part of my life, and it will continue to be, because the problem continues. It's not going to go away just because the British have decided to ban the sale of ivory in the UK. So let's just have a couple of minutes thinking about the illegal wildlife trade. This is an insidious, evil, disgusting trade that's worth, we think, around about $20 billion a year. I say we think worth about $20 billion a year because, you know what, the problem with poachers is they don't fill in tax returns. So we don't really know, and this is an estimation. So these are the last figures I've seen from DEFRA. These are from 2018, and this was done in the run-up to the Ivory Bill being introduced to the House of Commons, where they were suggesting it was going to be around about $20 billion a year. So this puts the illegal wildlife trade on a par with human trafficking. It puts the illegal wildlife trade on a par with the illegal arms trade. And it puts the illegal wildlife trade on a par with the illegal trade in drugs. So this is worth a lot of money to some very bad people. It is a huge industry. And it's getting worse, I'm afraid. We know that the trade increased between 2014 and 2016 by about 25–26%. So it's gradually increasing, despite the fact, you know, we have international legislation in place to try and curb it. It continues to grow, and 80% of the illegal wildlife trade is, we believe, the illegal trade in ivory. So if you put that into context, you can really see why it is my beloved elephants are on the brink, and something needs to be done very quickly. And of course, as an international community, we have responded. We've tried very hard to respond. The first thing is, of course, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. You can see why it's called CITES for short, can't you? 1975 treaty that aims to ensure that the international trade in these wild animals and plants doesn't threaten their survival in the wild. So it was ratified in 1973, and it was called at that time by a very, very famous criminologist, the Magna Carta for wildlife, which I think is the most wonderful thing to call it. If you think about the British Magna Carta and what that meant, here we're saying that this is going to be the new start for wildlife. We're drawing a line in the sand. We're ensuring going forward we will do better. So, you know, this is what CITES set out to do things better. And there are 184 parties to CITES right now. Of course, the UK is a founding member, and it is still a member of CITES, but there are 183 other members of CITES. So it is a truly global international treaty. At this stage, I use this slide a lot when I'm talking to my students, and it always elicits some very heartfelt responses. There are gasps, there are tuts. Somebody usually throws something at the Trump brothers over there on the right-hand side, and who can blame them? But I wanted to show you guys this afternoon because I think it's really important when we talk about the illegal wildlife trade that we acknowledge what it is in reality. So, you know, if you're walking down the Portobello Road in London and you come across an antique shop and you look in the antique shop window and you see something for sale there and you think, oh my, you know, that looks like ivory, and maybe it's a little bust, maybe it's some jewelry. Doesn't look like an elephant, does it? It seems a very long way from an elephant. And sometimes we just need to be reminded what the illegal wildlife trade means in reality. This is what the illegal trade in animals means in reality. It is a huge problem, and I'm afraid it has been bolstered by the actions of the Trump family in the States. There's lots of other people as well, but you know, they're an easy target, aren't they? Because they're right out there taking pictures of themselves shooting elephants. I don't know which Trump brother that is in the top picture there. That's an elephant's tail he's holding up as his little trophy. What a charmer. So we know that the ivory trade is directly linked to the decline in elephant populations. Now, I don't want you guys to go away this afternoon thinking the reason elephants are on the brink of extinction is because of poaching. In part it is, but that is not the full story. So please don't go away thinking that's the case. And if you want to talk to me more about the reasons for declining elephant populations, please give me a shout, because I'd love to talk to you about it. But today, just focusing on poaching and the illegal trade in ivory, CITES has put in steps, ways and means to try to protect African elephants. And I'm just looking at African elephants this afternoon. So CITES, as you guys probably all know, is made up of appendices. So 3 appendices in CITES. The 2 appendices, 1 and 2, are the most important, because those are the 2 that give the most protection to animals that are listed under those appendices. So in the case of the African elephant, my big handsome bull elephant that I showed you right at the start, all African elephants are Appendix 1 animals. So that means that trade, commercial international trade in African elephants is not allowed. It's completely prohibited. Now, I need to give you a little bit of extra information here, because the range states elephants in the range states. So by the range states, I mean Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe. Those range states, they're not included in Appendix 1, they're actually included in Appendix 2. And there is a good reason for that, although it may change in the future. The reason is most of Africa's wild elephant population are actually concentrated within the range states, so within those countries. So for instance, Botswana, with its incredible Okavango Delta, is home to around about 130,000 wild African elephants. So a lot of elephants are in that area. Because there are so many of them, they are Appendix 2. So if you're an animal that's listed under Appendix 2, like the African elephants in Botswana and Namibia, say, it means you need a permit if you want to commercially trade in them. And permits don't come easy when you're a CITES Appendix 2 animal. And you may very well have seen in the press just this week, there's been a big congress going on in the Southern African states right now. Excuse me. And part of the discussion is going to be around about how do we get the Appendix 2 lifted? How can we sell off some of our ivory that they have in stockpiles? Let's think a little bit about how African elephants have declined, certainly over the last century. So in 1930, there were 10 million wild elephants roaming Africa. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Today, there are around about 415,000. 10 million to 415,000 in just under 100 years. Extraordinary. And in the main, that incredible decline has been because of poaching. Poaching and conflict. Poaching and conflict have decimated the population of African elephants, together with climate change, together with the growth of the human population, all of these things together. But what a horrendous and terrifying decline in population. And it keeps going down. Poaching continues, I'm afraid. And that means my African elephant, my beautiful bull elephant, is nearer to extinction today than he has ever been. In fact, WWF, who regularly do data checks on poached elephants, they think that around about 20,000 elephants are killed a year just for their tusks. So this doesn't include elephants that are killed in human-wildlife conflict situations. Or you'll remember in Botswana a couple of years ago, there was a sudden death of 450 elephants around a waterhole. Doesn't include that. This is elephants that are being poached for their tusks. 20,000 a year are being poached for their tusks. So we've already talked, excuse me, about poaching, and it's still the biggest problem across the range states in southern Africa to the African elephant. And there is no doubt that the rapid decline in the African elephant population is mostly as a result of the intensified poaching in ivory. But there are other reasons, as I've mentioned. Habitat loss is a big one. So let's think about Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a target in the 1980s of around about 50,000 elephants. That's what they wanted back in their protected areas. So, you know, Zimbabwe has got a growing population. It's a very active population. It's a very vibrant country. It's rebuilding after some very turbulent years. But with that increase in population, more humans means more humans encroaching on what were protected areas. Alongside that, we have the fantastic Zimbabwean elephants are growing incredibly well. I mean, my goodness me, on the one hand, it's an incredible testament to Zimbabwe that they now have something like 83,000 animals within their boundaries, but it was never meant to be that much. It was never meant to get that big. They just simply don't really have the area to deal with that many big animals. So as a result of that, habitat gets lost. As the human population begins to grow, not good for elephants. And I've mentioned a couple of times human-elephant conflict. This is a real problem in the range states, particularly in Botswana and in Namibia. You know, you'll remember that Namibia had a terrible civil war, and that meant that people were moving out of more centralized areas into the elephant areas. So as they did that, they became increasingly in conflict with elephants. Botswana has had a similar problem for different reasons. So Botswana has always had very good policies in terms of looking after its wildlife. Botswana was very, very quick off the mark to realize, you know what, if we build it, they will come. I.e., if we put on the safari, show them our amazing wildlife, you know, the West will come here and pay lots of money to see these incredible animals in situ. So Botswana has always been very successful in doing that. In fact, with the 130 or so elephants they have got roaming in Botswana, the trouble is 70% of those are roaming outside protected areas. So I'm going to give you a first-hand knowledge, probably more like second-hand knowledge, that I actually have of this. So I have a very good friend and colleague who is a professor of economics. She's based down at the Okavango Research Institute, which, as you can tell, is in the Okavango Delta. And we were on a Zoom call one day having a lovely chat. And she said, hang on a minute, Caroline, I'll be back in just a second. And elephants just come through the fencing. So around her office, she had elephant-proof fencing. You know, this chap had just walked straight through it. And these guys can do that. You've got to remember, they're very, very, very big. The problem with this kind of increased human-elephant interaction is it invariably leads to human-elephant conflict. So put yourself in the position of a Namibian farmer. So these guys are not wealthy. They literally are living hand to mouth. They're trying to farm in an area that is very tough, very hard to farm in. They will be there because they've got a water source there and they will be trying to protect it. Enter an elephant who can drink out their water supply in a matter of hours, and that farmer, for him, it means his farm is lost. Everything he's worked for is going to die. And that invariably leads to deaths of elephants from farmers. And that is becoming an increasing problem, particularly Namibia are seeing this as an increasing problem. How do we change the narrative? How can we help save these elephants? Well, do you know what? I know Boris Johnson's getting a lot of bad rap right now, but I want to big up Michael Gove. Goodness bless Michael Gove. You don't hear me say that very often, Jo, do you? So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Ivory Act 2018. So as I told you earlier, this kind of kicked off in 2018. There was a consultation led by Michael Gove, who was then Secretary of State for the Environment at DEFRA. And he said, I want to create an act that is going to change the narrative. I want this country, the United Kingdom, to be leaders in the field of elephant protection. I don't want to see another dead elephant. I don't want to hear about it anymore. What can we do? So out of this comes the Ivory Act, which effectively bans the sale of ivory in the UK. I say effectively bans because, of course, there are some exemptions to the ban, but they're sensible exemptions. Kind of got to say that because I advised on this. So what are the exemptions? First one is portrait miniatures. Now, I'm sure you guys are all really well aware of what portrait miniatures are, those tiny little slithers of ivory that became very popular in Georgian England. About so big, no more than that. And they are so thin. The ivory is so thin. If you hold it up to the light, you can see right through it. It is very, very thin. And you can paint on it. This is what happens so that if you were a soldier who was heading off to war against the French, you wanted to take a picture of your wife, your mother, your lover, whoever, you want to take a picture of them with you. Taking a picture painted on parchment was a tricky thing to do and a little bit dangerous, because the moment you got bayoneted, that picture was a goner as well. However, if you painted it on ivory, it was actually much more robust and much more likely to survive the traumas and torments of Georgian warfare. So portrait miniatures, they're not made anymore, number one, for a start. And they're so thin, so thin. The surface area is so small. They can't be changed into something else. They can't be recarved into something else. There's simply not enough ivory there to do that. So after some robust lobbying by a very famous art specialist called Philip Mould, portrait miniatures were added to the list of exemptions. Then we have a de minimis exemption, which is very similar to the American de minimis exemption. So anything with less than 10% ivory by volume of the whole item, that's okay, provided it was made before 1947. Musical instruments made before 1975 with less than 20% volume ivory. Now, this was worked out very precisely and it accords with the keys on a piano. So post 1975, bearing in mind that's when CITES came into force, remember, post 1975, piano keys weren't ivory anymore. They were made of plastic. But if you've got a pre-1975 piano, in all likelihood, your keys are going to be ivory. And just over my shoulder over here is our family piano. It's a 1838 Chopard piano. It's got ivory keys. Oh, we're never going to sell the piano, but if we did, we would be enabled under this exemption, under the Act. The next exemption are items that qualify as museum quality. So anything that museums want to deal between themselves. So do you want to sell your item to another museum? Do you want to buy an item for another museum? That kind of thing. So super museum items. Really good example of something like this would be down here in Portsmouth. We have the Royal Marines Museum, which is awesome. If you're ever in Portsmouth, I highly recommend you go have a little look at it. I've got a student doing her work placement there at the moment. She sent me a photo of the Royal Marines bands. They have a big stand in the museum, and there are several ivory items there. They're museum items. That's okay. And the last piece, the last exemption, is items of outstanding cultural, historical or artistic significance. It must be pre-1918 and it has to be outstanding. How do we know whether something's outstanding or not? Well, you don't need to worry, because under the Ivory Act, a little group of people are appointed to decide whether your item is outstanding enough to be considered outstanding. So it's going to be very, very special things indeed. If you're going to sell one of these types of item, you will have to go to DEFRA and DEFRA will have a look at the item and the paperwork that you send along with your application, and if they agree that it can be sold under one of these exemptions, you will get a certificate for sale. And it's kind of like your item gets its very own passport. It will stay with the item forever to enable it to be sold. If you don't get a passport, you never get to sell the item. So let's go back to CITES, because we're going to change gear a little bit in a moment, and I think it's really important we understand a little bit more about CITES. So CITES is, as I've said, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And I've underlined endangered species here because, you know, in the main, it is aimed at creatures, flora and fauna, plants, animals that are still actually alive. So what it aims to do is ensure, not ban trade specifically, but it aims to ensure that any trade in wild species of flora and fauna doesn't threaten its survival in the wild. So that means that the trade in any kind of species covered by CITES has to be authorized through a special licensing system. So if you have a piece of redwood, you know, you want to make a nice table out of a redwood tree, for instance, you're going to need a CITES certificate to actually sell it, as an example. I've said that there are 3 appendices to CITES, number 1 offering the most protection all the way down to number 3 offering the least. So we know how all of that works together. Right now, CITES gives those varying degrees of protection to over 37,000 species of animals and plants. And, you know, that could be live specimens, so it could be animals that are being captured in the wild and sent somewhere else. It could be plants, so herbs, it could be fish, anything. If it's covered by CITES, it needs to be licensed to be moved, to be traded internationally. So this is what you've all been waiting for. I know you have. I've talked to you long enough about my beloved elephants. Here is a creature that I wish I'd gotten to see, the woolly mammoth. The only time I've really gotten to see a woolly mammoth is watching Ice Age with my daughter when she was a little bit younger. So if I have any Ice Age fans on the call this afternoon, hello, and thank you very much indeed. So I said that CITES is about protecting endangered species of wild fauna and flora. Now, you may say, Caroline, you have hit a bit of a problem here because, you know, you can't have an endangered extinct species. That would seem to be very, very strange. You're quite right. It would be very, very strange. And the trade in mammoth ivory is not illegal. So CITES does not currently cover the sale of mammoth ivory. Some states have decided to act on their own and to put in place their own domestic legislation to ban the trade in mammoth ivory, and India is one of those. So in India, they have their own domestic legislation that bans the dealing, import and export of mammoth ivory. However, excuse me, generally the international trade in mammoth ivory is really poorly documented because it doesn't have to be documented. It's not like a CITES species where I can tell you the last time this was sold, etc., etc. It's not like that. However, this has been a problem, and it's been on the radar of several of the CITES party members for some time. So in 2019, 2 CITES parties members, Israel and Kenya, decided they were going to try and do something about it. And they put a proposal to CITES to list mammoth as a threatened species. Okay, big problem. How can you have a threatened species that's extinct already. It's kind of missed the boat there. However, CITES is pretty clever, and CITES has got what we call the lookalike provision. So that means if there is an item from an animal that no longer exists, like our woolly mammoth, that looks very similar to an item that comes from an animal that's at risk, we could put it under this lookalike provision and thereby list it on the CITES appendix as a threatened species. So that's what it was Israel and Kenya were looking to do. So under the lookalike provision, they weren't really looking to ban the trade in mammoth ivory per se. What they wanted to say was, if you want to sell something to another country that you tell us is mammoth ivory, prove it. Prove this comes from a mammoth. So I just want to read you this little bit from the CITES proposal. This is what Israel and Kenya said in their application. Although trade in mammoth ivory, if correctly labelled, should not present an enforcement problem, the convention, the similarity between mammoth and elephant ivory is being used by unscrupulous traders to avoid CITES controls by labelling elephant ivory intended for export as mammoth. So what Israel and Kenya are saying here is, okay, we believe what's happening is people are selling elephant ivory pretending it's mammoth. Where have we seen this before? Well, you know, we have, and this is really the whole reason behind the Ivory Act 2018. It was the fact that there were similarities between elephant ivory and other types of bone in the main that enabled unscrupulous dealers, mostly antiques dealers, to sell ivory pretending it was bone, because you can sell bone, that's not a problem. Call it cow bone, you can do what the heck you like with it. It managed to circumvent the problems of CITES. So this was a big problem. We'd seen this all before. So the Ivory Act took all that on board and banned dealing in elephant ivory, apart from those small number of exceptions that we talked about earlier. But I've got to tell you guys, getting the Ivory Act from start to finish, it was not easy. It was not easy at all. Antique dealers were very, very unhappy about what they called stringent restrictions of the Act. They argued this is not going to do anything to stop poaching elephants. They said, think about the huge amounts of art and cultural objects that's going to become unsellable because of this act. In fact, one dealer who wrote into the Antiques Trade Gazette. The Antiques Trade Gazette is the weekly trade journal for the antiques trade. He said this: I cannot see how one elephant alive today will be saved by me not being able to sell this chess set. And they felt so strongly about this that the antiques trade collectively formed a private company, and they took a case of judicial review against DEFRA, which they ultimately lost, but it slowed the Ivory Act up again. Tara, it was a very, very difficult time. So I just wanted to show you how things, this is still happening now. So 6th of June, the Ivory Act came into force, and I've just put a couple of pictures on the screen for you here. Down in the bottom corner of the screen, those are billiards balls, so snooker balls, billiards balls. They're both ivory. They were advertised as antique bovine bone. The necklace up above, that is also ivory. That was described as antique faux bovine bone. Not quite sure why it had to be faux bovine bone, but I really just wanted to show you guys this to illustrate to you how dealers of ivory try to circumnavigate the rules to offer their illegal ivory for sale. Now, the reality is, under the old rules, under the old Control of Trade and Endangered Species rules, certainly the billiards balls were most likely legal to sell. Most billiards balls were made of ivory, which is kind of like plastic. It's not plastic, it's a bit more fancy than plastic, but it's plastic, it's man-made. Let's leave it there, not get into the science, it's man-made. Ivory took over from ivory for the making of billiards balls, certainly in the 1920s and early 1930s, so certainly pre-1947. But these guys know enough to know they shouldn't be advertising for sale online. These are both from eBay. They shouldn't be advertising ivory for sale online. So what do? Let's call it something else and slap up some awesome pictures where people can very clearly see the Schroeder lines and know that it is in actual fact ivory. So we've seen this before, this look-alike issue. It's been there all the time. So I think what Kenya and Israel were trying to do was a very interesting move. So the big question really is, knowing all of that, can the mammoth save the elephant? Israel and Kenya's proposal was, I believe anyway, the first time that a proposal had ever come before CITES to list an extinct species on the appendix. An extraordinary move. But there's nothing in CITES that stops you from doing that. CITES doesn't say, by the way, you can't list an extinct species. So they weren't doing anything sort of ultra vires in trying to get the mammoth onto the appendix. Could it be an important way to prevent the extinction of the African elephant? That's my big question really today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys think about this. So from the genus Mammoths, there are 5 extinct species. And of course, the most famous one is the woolly mammoth. But it also includes all living relatives of the mammoths, the elephants. So they come from the same genus. So it's not beyond the wit of man, is it? And although Israel and Kenya's proposal to CITES didn't pass, the problem for CITES is they said there's really not enough evidence. You've brought us a really good story. You've brought us a really good tale of what you think is going on, but there's not enough evidence here for us to enter mammoth onto the appendix. So they added that the inclusion of mammoth could result in more smuggling of mammoth ivory, and actually create an increased enforcement issue where there had not been one previously. And for CITES, that was a problem because, they said, look, countries are having enough trouble trying to police the poaching of their living elephants, let alone long dead ones. So that was a big problem for them. But there's a lot of mammoths out there, everyone. You will have seen on the news, read it in the paper, heard it on the radio. There are thought to be something like 10 million mammoths in the Russian permafrost. 10 million. And every time the permafrost melts, a little bit more comes to light. So almost weekly, the hunters, the cost hunters, are finding more mammoth tusks. This is not something that's going to go away. It is something we're going to have to deal with. So woolly mammoths are the big one, really. The reason for that is their tusks are massive, which is really great for carvers, obviously. And the tusk of a woolly mammoth are very similar to the tusk of an elephant. You know, other mammoth tusks are very brittle, so they're very difficult to carve, but woolly mammoth tusks are much more like elephant ivory, so they're much easier for carving, much easier to decorate. How can you tell them apart? Well, you know, an African elephant tusk is fairly straight. It'll have a little curve at the top. Hope you can see my hand movements there. Sorry about that. But a woolly mammoth tusk, you know, just like Manny in Ice Age, they've got a little bit of a corkscrew going on, a little bit of a twist. They're very, very beautiful things to look at. So they look different when you see them as whole tusks. You put a mammoth tusk and an elephant ivory tusk together, you can totally tell the difference between them. Now, the problem is for buyers of mammoth or buyers of ivory, because they are in part the same people, is that mammoth tusk can carry a bad feng shui. And the reason for that is, you know, it comes from an animal that's died. So if you're buying ivory, and this would be a great idea, let's be honest, wouldn't it, is if we could sell the ivory of a long dead creature in lieu of elephant ivory, thereby we save the elephants. If we could do that, wouldn't that be awesome? So why is that not happening? And this is the reason. The feng shui of a mammoth tusk, mammoth ivory, is said to be bad because it comes from an extinct animal. It's an animal that failed to survive. Do you want that in your living room when you're about your feng shui? So the argument is by Siberian traders, by the traders in Russia who go out and collect the mammoth ivory, is while there is still slon around, people will always buy slon. Slon is just Russian for elephant ivory, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. Now, we mentioned Schroeder lines earlier. I think I pointed out some Schroeder lines to you in the billiards ball that we had a look at. So mammoth ivory, it's got rather a cool nickname, which makes it slightly ethereal. For collectors of mammoth ivory, they call it ice ivory. And it looks, as I said, very, very similar to elephant ivory. But in addition to one being straightish and one being the corkscrewy kind of look of a whole tusk, when you cut through a piece of ivory, you can tell it's ivory by what I call the Schroeder lines. So in the picture here, you can see the cross hatchings, the Schroeder lines, very, very clearly. And that's what you're going to be looking for, certainly what I'm looking for when I look at a piece of ivory, to ascertain what type of ivory it is, what kind of animal it comes from. Now, for me, most of my research in the past has been looking at a piece of ivory and saying, okay, is this elephant ivory? Is this marine ivory? By which I mean, has it come from a whale? Has it come from a walrus? Or something else, you know, hippopotamus, for example. So I'm looking at those Schroeder lines because the differing degree of the Schroeder line will tell me what animal it came from. And the same rule applies exactly when you're talking about mammoth ivory. So when you're talking about mammoth ivory and you look at the Schroeder lines, if it is mammoth, the Schroeder lines will be at 90 degrees. If it is more than 90 degrees, so 100 degrees plus, it's going to be elephant ivory. So that's what you need to be looking at to really be able to see whether or not the item is elephant or mammoth. So big problems here. It's not always possible to see the Schroeder lines, number one, particularly if the item has been carved into something much smaller and you can't see the cross hatchings. It makes it very difficult to see simply from the item whether or not it's from an elephant or from a mammoth. However, that does not stop ivory reaching some crazy high figures. March 2021, a 30,000-year-old blue woolly mammoth tusk that was called the Ocean to really get the bidders going, went to auction. The guide price was $70,000. I've tried desperately hard to find out for you guys what this actually sold for. It's the bottom picture here on the screen. It's quite extraordinary color to it, isn't it? And that's not paint. That's through mineralization in the frost. It's quite extraordinary, beautiful color. I haven't been able to find out what it actually sold for, but the estimate was $70,000. And then, you know, there was the very, very famous woolly mammoth skeleton, the most intact ever found. It sold for $645,000. November 2019, a Siberian mammoth tusk sold to China for $100,000, and July 2015, mammoth tusk, this was a group of them, it wasn't just one tusk, sold for $2.3 million. So there's a lot of money in these tusks. And you know what, as always, my friends, money is the root of all evil, isn't it? Money is the reason the elephant is being poached to extinction. Money is the reason that the mammoths are being dug up from the permafrost. So the major legal and illegal exporter of mammoth tusks is Russia. And there's a particular province in Siberia called Yakutia. And that is where most of the high quality woolly mammoth tusks are found. So what happens is there will be tusk hunters in Yakutia who will go out on tusk hunting exercises. They will find the tusks, they will pull the excavate, let's call it what it is, excavate the tusk out of the permafrost, and they will send it via Hong Kong to mainland China. Now, what the Russians have discovered is that this trade has gone crazy over the last 20 years. So the Russians believe that it's gone from 9 tons a year of exported mammoth ivory from 20,000 to 2003, 31 tons from 2007 to 2013, and then by 2018, Russia was exporting 100 tons of mammoth ivory a year. Now, meanwhile, so you've got the volume going up, strangely enough, because normally it's a matter of economics, isn't it? But meanwhile, the wholesale price has been increasing as well. And this has been in the main due to increased demand in China. So now the price of a kilo of cost or mammoth ivory is around about $600 a kilo, very similar to the price of elephant ivory. But you know what, that has come down. That's almost a third of what it was in 2014. So it's actually dropped since 2014. So here in this picture, the top picture, this is what a mammoth ivory tusk looks like when it's pulled out of the mined from the permafrost. So you can see that little corkscrew twist to it there, can't you? Russian government believe that around about a third of the 100 tons that gets brought out of Yakutia every year is actually done illegally, and nobody's got any kind of permit to do it. And this is not good for the Russians. The Russians don't like this because it means they're not getting paid. So if you're doing it illegally, you haven't got your permit, you're not paying the government, not good. So for the Yakutia region, they're losing money as a result of this illegal activity. So Russia, that's not for us to worry about. There's not much we can do. Russia needs to tighten up their permit system, and they need to tighten up their law enforcement around the illegal, excuse me, exportation of the mammoth ivory tusks. So the cost of cost. Cost in Russian simply means bone, and it's how they refer to mammoth ivory, as opposed to slon, which is Russian for ivory. So it's their way of differentiating between the two types of things. Most, as I've said, most of the mammoth ivory that's mined in Russia goes to China. And Russia has put in place a pretty tight regulatory system. So if you are a cost harvester in Yakutia, you are told how much you can collect, how much it's going to cost you, what you're going to pay in tax, who you can sell it to, etc., etc. But the problem is a third of the trade, despite the regulation, is thought to be illegal and not adhering to any of those principles at all. Under the Russian law and regulation, you can these hunters, the cost hunters, can only recover cost that is on the surface of the permafrost, for all very, very good reasons. Because, you know, you really don't want people digging into the permafrost and making a bad situation worse for the permafrost. But I can say whether or not that's done. In fact, I've got some photos to show you in a moment where I can show you it is clearly not done, and they mine. In fact, they mine with very high-powered water jets to get the cost out of the ground. So in terms of mammoth ivory, it's classified. So A, B, C, D, A being the bee's knees of mammoth ivory, and D being you really don't want it at all. So A is what everybody is looking for. So now currently in Russia, you'll be paying around about $300 a kilo for grade A cost. And what the buyers really, really want are intact tusks that don't have any cracks in them. They're going to be the most valuable. Number one, because they could be carved much more easily. If you've got two, if you've got a pair that have come from the same animal, perfect. That is going to get you the really big bucks. Now, interestingly, you'll remember that back in 2018, China started making moves to close their ivory markets. And initially a one-year moratorium was put on the ivory trade within China. That corresponded with a fall in the price of mammoth ivory going into China. And in China right now, the mammoth trade is really under the microscope, and the government is looking very closely at what is being sold as what. Is what you're selling as mammoth really ivory? And buyers, people, are concerned about buying it too. When they buy a piece of mammoth ivory, are they really buying mammoth ivory, or is it really elephant ivory? Okay, my nemesis, enter eBay. Now, I've got to tell you, I love eBay for most things. I'm a big lover of secondhand clothes, and it's the best place in the world to go and buy a new pair of, something nice, isn't it? But it is also the go-to place to buy elephant ivory. BBC did a program just really recently about eBay and the sale of ivory online. So with these excellent photographs, where you really don't need to go through the whole hoo-ha of it's really bovine bone, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You don't need that anymore. The quality a photo I can take with my little iPhone, which isn't a fancy one, I can tell you that, but the quality of photo I can take can show very clearly any Schroeder lines, and so much less text is needed. Now, eBay are really well aware of that, and they're working on how they can improve their systems to ensure things don't get through. And they realized in 2018 that mammoth ivory was a bit of a problem for them, and that things were being sold on eBay pretending to be made of a mammoth ivory when they were in fact elephant. So in 2018, eBay banned the sale of mammoth ivory. So in a sense, we could say eBay's getting there sooner than CITES is. The problem, and this is a perennial problem really with eBay, is that they instigate a ban, but their policing of the ban is not good. So things get through. So this little thimble, I wanted to show you this because I think it's just classic eBay advertisement. So this was advertised on eBay UK, and the advert said, "Thimble, thimble leg, not ivory, exclamation mark, mammoth, question mark." In fact, when you look, I don't know how good your picture is on your screen here, but there are really clear Schroeder lines on the top of that lovely little thimble. Perfect for me to be able to tell you the Schroeder lines are most definitely elephant ivory. So those parallels that we started off thinking about an hour ago, there have been shipments that have been stopped by law enforcement officers when they've entered port that have found mammoth ivory being used to transport illegal ivory from poached African elephants. So that is a very direct and very visual link between the two trades, and research is ongoing as to the size of the problem, the scale of the problem, and we need to really gauge how that is affecting the illegal ivory trade. But wildlife conservationists generally, so when you talk to somebody like John Scanlon from the Elephant Protection Initiative, or you talk to Born Free, or you talk to Stop Ivory, any of these guys, all of them say that maintaining a trade in elephant ivory only fuels the demand for, the trade in mammoth ivory only fuels the demand for elephant ivory generally, because one acts as a foil for the other. You know, it's like you're keeping it behind the curtain. What I wanted to finish with is just to tell you about how I came to fall in love with elephants. So my husband and I got married in 2005, and all I'd ever wanted to do was go to Africa. I think I'd read Out of Africa as a young woman. It was the most romantic thing ever in the history of the world. And so we went on a safari to southern Africa. And we stayed at a very famous, very historic lodge inside the Kruger National Park. And Patrick, our ranger, was an amazing guy. He was an ex-poacher. And one thing that this lodge is very famous for is paying it forward. And when Patrick got caught and charged with poaching, they offered him a job and said, well, you know what, you're clearly really good at finding animals. Do you want to come and work for us? So that's what happened. And Patrick, by the time we met him, was one of their most senior rangers, an amazing guy. So this is just a really short extract from my diary in 2005. At a little after 5 p.m, Patrick stopped the Land Rover so we could take pictures of a lioness nursing her 2 cubs. The sun was starting to set and it was completely peaceful. Suddenly, the lioness lifted her head. She sniffed the air and stood up. Her cubs followed. Patrick turned to us and put his index finger to his lips. Shh, stay quiet, stay still. You're very lucky, Patrick said as he pointed to the hill in front of us. What happened next was we could feel the ground beneath our Land Rover start to vibrate, and it was the most extraordinary feeling. I could feel it in my bones. My bones were starting to shake. And over the hill in front of us came a herd of about 25 African elephants. And it was an evening really just like the one in the picture here. The sun was starting to set and they powered over this hill. Little ones, big ones, absolutely amazing. And what I remember from that day in the Kruger was how wonderful nature is, how powerful it is when it's in equilibrium. And what I'd like you guys to take away from this afternoon, apart from my humblest thanks for coming and listening to my story of my elephants, is please keep your world in equilibrium. Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed talking to you. And Jo, can I stop sharing now and pass back to you?
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much. I think that I mean that was amazing, and I'm really grateful to you, Caroline, because you also put in such a wonderful context for research and how research develops, because you often don't get to hear about that and don't get to hear how things shift us in different directions. And I thought that was also quite an invaluable part of the discussion. I mean, I have notes myself and questions, but first I would like to open it to the audience. So if there are any questions from the audience, you can either pop them in the chat or raise your hand or just turn on your mic and ask a question. We're running it quite informally, roundtable style. So do please just raise any questions that you might have. Otherwise, I will start without you. Any questions?
I'd love to hear everybody's questions and thoughts on the mammoth, really, because we're really just starting the geocultural property project right now. It's in its early stages, so it's a great opportunity for me to pick everyone's brains as well. If there's anything you've always wanted to know but never had anyone to ask, please say, because I'll ask the question and I will find out for you.
Well, I mean, it's just something that is fresh in my mind at the moment. So, because we just well, it was actually in a fashion module that I teach, but we were talking about the use of fur, and what I thought was quite interesting was how the different ways of approaching the mining of mammoths, and also the different perspectives on what it might actually mean for ivory. So we were looking at fur, and we were looking at the reuse of vintage fur. We were looking at the issues with faux fur, because not only may faux fur be a very environmentally unsound option, but also it might not even be vegan because of the dyes and glues and what have you. And the other issue is, of course, that it maintains an appetite for that aesthetic. And what I find quite interesting about and obviously ivory is not just about an aesthetic, but that is certainly an element of it. What I found quite interesting about the discussion was, I mean, CITES itself it's almost an aesthetic element. I mean, the lookalikes provision is
totally.
So it really is about how you identify it, yes, but there is that aesthetic element. And I just wondered if there is I mean, you did discuss this a little bit, but maybe if you had a few further thoughts on how much you think that part of the reason we should be looking to address mammoth mining is because, of course, it maintains an appetite for ivory. So yes, it can be disguised. It can be used to mislead about what is actually ivory. But is there an issue there as well about the actual market itself?
Well, I think for certain, Joe, the conservationist belief there is. There's no doubt about that. And as I say, if you mention to John Scanlon about mammoth ivory, he'll turn a funny shade of puce. Because for him, an item that's so similar to elephant ivory fuels the demand. If it's so similar that I don't mean to sound derogatory, but if the ordinary man on the street cannot tell the difference between elephant ivory and mammoth ivory and doesn't know what he's buying, the demand is being fueled, and that is the big problem. Additionally to that, Joe, you mentioned the mining, and I'm so glad you used the word mining, because that's completely what it is, totally what it is. The Yakutia is a very distant province of Russia. It's a very inhospitable place, seriously inhospitable place. And in my head, when I started looking into this, I thought, oh my goodness, you'll be just wandering around, walking down a track, and there's a lump of ivory sticking out, and that's just not how it is at all. In actual fact, the cost is under the ground in the main, and these guys are using very high-powered water jets to dig it out, to mine it. You used exactly the right word, to mine this stuff. And we are talking about a very fragile ecosystem here. We're talking about what is left of the permafrost of Siberia. And these guys it's so horrifying on so many levels, but that is really what worries me. If it simply was a case of tusks that have naturally come to the surface and are lying on the surface, I think I'd feel less concerned about it. But knowing that's really not what it is, maybe it was in the start, but now you've got to dig for it. Now you have to mine for it. The damage that is doing to that ecosystem, it's astounding. It's shocking.
Yeah, that actually, and that adds a really interesting dimension, I think, because it's a similar kind of discussion. The alternative, is there any damage with the alternative? So so I mean, the fur analogy again, looking at then how that leads to innovation in other areas, so textile innovation in alternatives that are sustainable. But at the same time, the question is, should it actually just be a shift in aesthetic? Is that the issue here? So, but the sustainability question, I mean, the unsustainability of mammoth mining, and thinking about it also, I mean, the arguing that the extinct animal is endangered is interesting. I mean, in the discourse of and the definition of extinction and endangerment, then you're kind of struggling, but the resource is endangered.
Exactly. It is exactly that. So maybe there are 10 million mammoths out there still waiting to be found, but that they're not lying on the surface. They need to be dug out. They need to be dug out of the permafrost, and that's still 10 million. That's always going to be a shrinking number. They are endangered. They are an endangered extinct species. We need a new category for CITES, but it is quite extraordinary. And the other thing that I think really worries me, and this probably plays into your idea of the aesthetics, is what's happening to the cost when it is dug out of the ground, and it's the ice ivory. I know I showed you the ocean for a very particular reason. Now, that is the most beautiful color blue, and I can see why it got nicknamed the ocean ready for sale. It is extraordinary. It's not paint, it's mineralized like that. It was dug out of the ground looking like that. Now that's not going to get carved up because it's worth more looking the way it looks. But most cost coming out of the ground doesn't look like that. It looks like the brownie mucky coloured one that was on the boat, really. That is the one that worries me. It's the brownie mucky coloured one. That's what's getting shipped off to China, to the Chinese ivory markets, where it's carved into various different things, you know, trinkets. Let's just call them trinkets, to be passed to in the main Chinese buyers, and they're being sold to Chinese buyers as ivory. So there are many levels of illegality here. There's the illegality of mining, the cost in the first place. There's the illegality of illegally transporting it to China without the right permits. Second, there's the illegality of it being sold as something else. Third, and the illegality keeps going on.
Yeah, and it's such a I mean, it is such a complex question, because it is these interactions between the legal frameworks, but also these social, cultural, political, and as a scientific resource as well. I mean, it's a biological resource. It's also a cultural resource, and the idea that it might be exhausted in order to make, as you say, these trinkets to sustain a market that kind of needs re-education, if you like, is quite alarming.
You're quite right. Actually, one of the guys who we have working on the elephant ivory project for this part of the project is actually a paleontologist. He gets so angry.
Yes.
You can see the steam coming out of his ears, you know. This is a scientific specimen, and you should hear him on fossils. He's even worse on fossils.
Yeah.
But it's a very fair point, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's lost data, it's lost information.
Exactly. And I think that's a huge part of the discussion as well.
Yeah, completely. It totally is.
Yeah. I'm quite dominating the questions here, though. So it's any questions from the audience, or any points? We have one. What can you say about hunting associations as conservationists? Yes, that's a good one with the pictures.
Oh, that's a really good one.
Yeah, that's a very
okay. I do have to be careful what.
Oh, but not too careful. We can always pause the recording if you like, Caroline.
You might have to. Do you know what? I have a really lovely friend. She's an ex-associate head of Portsmouth Law School. She's no longer at Portsmouth Law School because she left to join an organisation called BOAC, which is the British organisation for shooting and killing stuff, basically. So she left to join them as their head of legal research. And she's a really nice girl. She had always been very supportive of the Ivory project and said, you know, she was a conservationist and really keen to see particularly British wildlife conserved in a far better way. And then she joined this organization. And I said to her, how on earth can you call yourself a conservationist and become the research lead for British hunting and shooting, fishing and killing? And she said, well, you know, we're not about that. We're about conserving items through management. Okay, so we've got to think about that, haven't we, really, Gilmarie? We have to think about that as a concept. Can you conserve wildlife through the managed hunting of that wildlife? So British wildlife, I know quite a lot about. Southern African wildlife I know a little bit more about probably. So let's think about that in terms of Southern African wildlife. It's certainly true that even Botswana, who are the leading lights, the shining example of how to look after your wildlife, it's true. They have hunting permits. They allow permitted hunting within their protected areas. So you go buy a permit, and that will allow you to take, I don't know, one elephant, one giraffe, a couple of kudu, whatever it is. And part of me thinks that's shocking. How can that be conservation? But the realist in me thinks some stupid American, probably, sorry if we've got any lovely Americans on the call, I do not include you in that comment. Someone has paid a lot of money to go shoot one animal. Now, the rangers are very savvy people, so they will be taking the guns to animals that are old, infirm, nearing the end of their natural coil. If the hunters aren't proficient shots, the rangers are on hand to dispatch the animal quickly so that they have as little trauma in their last minutes as possible. And for that, the Botswanan government gets a lot of money, which goes back into conservation efforts. So we have to think about all of this stuff in the round, because you know what? I don't want to sound over dramatic, but this is going to sound over dramatic. We're fighting a war here. We have got animals that are becoming extinct left, right, and center. African elephants could become extinct in the next 5 years if something isn't done quickly to stop that happening. And what do we need? We need money. We need money so we have more rangers, so that we have better protected areas. How do you get that money? Well, this is a surefire way of getting money, because somewhere there's some stupid idiot that wants to shoot an elephant. And if you're taking him to the very elderly bull that's no longer head of the herd because he's been outgunned by his younger brother, maybe that's okay. I don't know what you think. Gilmarie, what do you think? I'd love to hear what you think about that kind of conservation. I don't think Gilmarie's going to tell me what they think.
I mean, it's interesting because it goes back to sort of early type welfare models before the word welfare even came into it.
Yeah.
But that kind of conservation model of animals as a resource, and the idea of conserving animals through their management as a resource through these economic models. I mean, I do understand what you're saying about the income. I mean, it is extremely complex. It's interesting what you were saying about the death, and the idea of a good death. How much of this hunting is just that sort of stealth hunting though, and how much is it pursuit? Do you know? Or
well, certainly in Botswana, it's very tightly regulated. So when a hunting party, a permitted hunting party, will go out into the bush, they'll have at least one, probably two trained rangers with them who will have predetermined what it is they're going to take down. And that will have been predetermined, Joe, on the basis usually of the animal's health.
Yeah, so it's age, more of a stalking than a
totally, yeah.
I mean, in terms of thinking of their last hours, but yeah, the idea of because I'm quite interested in how that fits alongside discussions in welfare biology and wild animal welfare and wild animal suffering as newish concepts, or as not necessarily as mainstream concepts, because when we talk about wild animals a lot, it's about managing populations and not about individuals, and I think that's an interesting distinction. there's a question. There's a couple, and we've been so excited. That's not the right word. The first question is, one way to support CITES would be to have a rule in national law that inverses the burden of proof. An item is deemed to be made of elephant ivory, hence forbidden, unless there is convincing proof that it's made of, let's say, mammoth ivory.
What an awesome idea. You're not far off here, actually. When we started the Ivory project, I started working with a really cool inspector at the Metropolitan Police, and it was so much fun waltzing into New Scotland Yard. It was awesome. But Inspector Appleton headed up an operation on the Portobello Road called Operation Gulag. Have you ever come across that one, Joe, with your cultural property hat on? So Matt was the copper who was charged with nicking antique dealers on the Portobello Road for the illegal sale of ivory and other illegal wildlife trade products. His view was he wanted to bring a case to court where it was a strict liability offence, effectively. So not quite what our questioner was asking, but he really wanted to see the law changed. So it became the case of, you are selling ivory unless you prove otherwise. So a strict liability offence, and I think because Matt's quite hard-headed, so I think he'd have gone with that if it hadn't been for the fact that the Ivory Act was coming up really quickly on the back of a lot of work he'd done, I have to say, and the fact the Crown Prosecution Service weren't having any of it. He was horrified by the Crown Prosecution Service not wanting to have any of it. But you're not really that far off the mark. So could we do something similar with Mammoth? It wouldn't be CITES, it would have to be individual jurisdictions that would do that. At the moment, I don't think there's the appetite to, because the truth is we don't really have the data. We don't really know what's happening to the mammoth ivory yet, right now. But perhaps in the future, it's a really interesting idea.
And you, I mean, the costs of enforcing that are not unreasonable, are they? Because I mean, you don't have the data, but there is at least accessible technology to determine the differences. So it's not quite the same as, say, trying to police dog and cat fur at the Customs and Border Control, something like that. It's actually easier than that. So
yes, it is. You're quite right. It is. If you can see the Schroeder lines, it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we have another couple of questions. They're coming in thick and fast. So we have if e-auctions such as the one on eBay are so out in the public, why doesn't the government enforcement agencies why don't they penalize them?
Oh, what a good question. When you know the answer, could you ring me up and tell me? That would be amazing. So we've been doing a little bit of work on eBay for a couple of years now. I think they must hate me with all their dear little eBay hearts, because I'm constantly on at them about something or other that they're doing. Why doesn't the British police forces, why don't they take action against eBay? Well, Jo will tell you, because she's an IP lawyer, and Jo will know about a French case, it's not an English case, a French case that involved a certain lipstick company called L'Oreal. And L'Oreal had a bit of a set to with eBay in the French courts over counterfeit lipstick. And these guys, L'Oreal wasn't the only people to do this, but it's L'Oreal, so everybody knew who they were. It's not a dissimilar kind of situation here. If the police are going to take a case to court in the UK, they have to get it through our Crown Prosecution Service, first of all. The British Police Force are not a prosecuting authority. That's the Crown Prosecution Service's job. So a case file will land on the CPS desk, and the CPS will look at it all and say, what is the probability of me winning this case? And so they have to know they've got a good chance of winning this case before they'll take it any further. Up to this point, eBay have argued that, look, we are not the seller. Don't shoot the messenger. We're just the platform. We tell people what they can put on our platform. Some of them don't abide by our rules, but you can't shoot us for that. That's kind of eBay's position, and they've stuck to that really stringently. The British police force are looking at eBay. I can tell you that because we're working with them on checking Ivory for sale online. And they have brought not eBay to court, but eBay's sellers. So eBay is not a party to the prosecution, but through eBay, the police have found the sellers and brought the sellers to court. In fact, there was a big case a few years ago now in Portsmouth with a Portsmouth seller who was selling illegal ivory on eBay. So it's not eBay that are getting prosecuted, but the seller is getting prosecuted. I have to say, I agree, Joe, with our questioner here. Why can't we do anything about eBay? But the problem, as I hope I am adequately explaining to you, is the position that eBay hold in this tale of woe.
Yeah,
they're not the seller. They're not the seller.
Yeah, and then of course the difference with L'Oreal and IP is, well, you have commercial interests there trying to protect their IP, but they have an opportunity to put eBay on notice, whereas it might be more difficult. I mean, it's not impossible, but you know that that's your trademark. Can you actually effectively put eBay on notices to other things? Or they'd have to be actively involved. So that's the obstacle there. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, it's a very important question. Teeth of some animals, such as tiger, are used as amulets in Asia. Which treaty should protect the animal in this case?
Well, that would be CITES as well. Tiger, I'm pleased to tell you, is a CITES protected species. So things like tiger teeth necklaces, that would fall under the CITES convention. So tigers are protected. But isn't that a sad point, Joe, that our questioner brings to us right there? You know, this is a protected CITES animal, and yet I don't know where they've seen this necklace for sale. I'd be interested if they told you where they've seen tiger teeth necklace for sale. I haven't seen one for a long time, I have to say, but I'm afraid, yeah. But with tiger, the big problem now really is not so much the amulet, it's the bones of tigers being ground down for use in traditional Chinese medicine, and that's another big area of concern that really needs to be dealt with.
It actually raises an interesting question, because there's lots of areas of you know, animal welfare, animal suffering concerns, or major issues where the conflict is actually with cultural and traditional perspectives, and that's all around the world, like traditional hunting methods or traditional festivals in Europe, and traditional medicines, and that's interesting, because there we see the conflict between religion and tradition and the animal suffering, and that becomes quite a complex question. And arguably you would say ivory also is affected by some of that.
Completely.
Well.
Yeah, ivory isn't really used in traditional Chinese medicine in the same way, but it is very important to Chinese culture as a symbol of wealth and power. So yeah, the elephant has been similarly adversely affected.
And we have another question. So this is about the legislators' perspectives. How differently do they see elephant, ivory, and mammoth? Are there different enforcement mechanisms, such as criminal components and punishment for each?
And that's a really interesting question, but a sadly easy answer. Mammoth ivory is legal to sell, except in India, brackets. India's way ahead of us, but everywhere else, it's legal to sell. It's not even on their radar. Sorry. I'm sorry. I wish I had better news for you there.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I mean, that also points to the discussion we were having about those different perspectives and how important it is how you frame what it is at stake with mining mammoths. What is at stake with mining mammoths, not just about whether or not it looks like elephant ivory, and that's bad enough. Yes. But how you frame the mammoth as well as a kind of, almost like a, I mean, I don't want to, I mean, in the discussion about them as an endangered species, but what is at stake for the mammoth? I mean, yes, extinct, but this, how you frame that in such a way that it isn't just about whether or not you can find it.
I think for mammoth, we can't talk about them as an endangered species. No. Of course, we can't talk about them as an endangered species, but we can talk about them as an important cultural.
Exactly.
I can't say species, but you know what I mean, Jo. They are culturally so significant, so important. It's all being lost. And what's interesting, you know, I said that India has actually got domestic legislation in place that deals with the sale of mammoth ivory. And that's really to protect the Indian elephant, by the way. They're very sensible people in India. Russia has got legislation, but it's not there to protect the mammoth or what's left of the mammoth. It's not there to protect the geoculture. It's there to raise money. It's there for permits. You want it, you pay for it. That's the way that they're dealing with it. And so what happens? Well, you know, as I said, Yakutia is a jolly big place, and the cost hunters just don't buy the permits. There aren't enough people to police the area, so they take their chance.
And that is a major issue for illegal wildlife trade.
Totally right, Jo. You know, when I think about poachers in the Southern African states, like Patrick, who was our ranger, he had been a poacher, and when we spoke to him about his life as a poacher, why? Because when you were with him, he was the gentlest person, quiet, unassuming, and really in tune with his surroundings. And it didn't seem possible to me that he could have been a poacher. And so we asked him, you know, why did you do it? He said, well, I needed to feed my family. And if you ask one of the cost hunters in Yakutia, why do you dig out the permafrost to collect the cost? Why are you doing it? You will get, Jo, the same answer. I do it to feed my family. So, you know, I don't want you guys to go away thinking poachers are evil, ghastly, horrible people, because in the main, they're not. They're doing this out of necessity, not out of some desire to kill. The problem is it's got to the point now where the species are at risk, and it has to end.
It's interesting because the poachers may not be motivated by a desire to kill, but the Trumps are.
Oh yes, don't get me started there either, Jo, because you'll need to.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. I mean, I was really fascinated by Israel and Kenya's. I mean, when I talk about endangered, it was in reference to Israel and Kenya's proposal that you include an extinct animal in the appendices. But I do find that very interesting, because the way CITES views populations as a resource in a sense. I mean, notwithstanding the lookalikes provision, it is not at odds with that discussion, but what it might mean for other things. But I think if you start to talk about the mammoth in view of as being a biological resource, extinct or not, and that what it contributes to biodiversity, that is actually in part in the spirit of CITES. I just wonder if you think that there is a potential for this to become a consideration, given that we are faced with an alarming extinction crisis, and if there are extinct animals that do present a resource that people are interested in mining, how that might have a negative impact on biodiversity, biological diversity, including how we sort of study it. Do you think that that's something that either can be accommodated by CITES, or are we going to have to look for something to govern that space?
Yeah, I think it's not going to be something CITES will be able to handle, and down the line we're going to need a new international convention, the International Convention on Geoheritage, or something along those lines, something like that, that deals with the cultural and scientific resource from extinct species of flora and fauna. I think it's going to be poor CITES. Can you? No. God, honestly, Joe.
I mean, that was really just a thought experiment, I promise you. But I completely agree. I think that this is something that hasn't been readily anticipated. And given what we are dealing with, is absolutely necessary.
Yes, I think you're right. I don't know about you, but when I'm having periods of insomnia, I lay abed at night and think we are entering the next phase of mass extinction. I just know we are. And just to depress myself further. And I know we are, because it feels to me, I don't know how it feels to you, Joe, but it feels to me that whatever we do, it's never going to be enough. The tipping point was 100 years ago. It's too late. It's too late to do anything to stop it now, and we're sliding towards this precipice now of the next phase of mass extinction. We are going to lose a lot of very important creatures, and that has a huge effect for all of us. You know, I said everything is connected. Everything is connected, and losing one will have, it's a butterfly effect. So no, it depresses me greatly, and it keeps me awake at night.
I
that and the dog snoring, both of them keep me awake at night.
That is true.
Fellow border terrier owner, you know what I'm talking about.
I had one other point that as you were speaking about Patrick, and you spoke about how in tune he was with his environment, and of course that makes me think about a lot of the history of what we know about hunting and the relationship between hunting in early communities and their increasing knowledge of the animals around them, and there's a lot of people who've written about that relationship between hunting, not as a kind of sport, but the relationship between hunting as one of kind of mutual observation and knowledge. So and that actually hunting in that context has a lot to do with being very attuned to the behavior of the hunted, to knowledge of the hunted. It's always an interesting question.
You're quite right, and of course that's where Patrick's where his sense of knowing himself in his environment must have come from. And when you were on a drive with him, and we'd say, it was hilarious, really, Joe, every morning, 3 giraffes, first thing we saw every day. It's like he paid them to turn up. Like, okay, there they are again. And here, Patrick, do these guys never move? Are they always there? He said, look at the time. Look at the time. It's like, stupid. it's the time. And he just understood how the African savannah worked. Astounding man, really incredible man. A great privilege to have met him.
We have one more question. So it's again on the conservationist question. It's a balancing act that government leaders have to deal with every day. Money from hunting associations that would help serve many of their constituents, as opposed to taking care of an old and infirm endangered species. I'm not sure if the question means an old infirm member of an endangered species or the whole species. That's
I do think I understand your question.
It's a socio-political issue that is difficult to deal with because of the many ramifications. Which is more important? What is their priority?
Or what should their priority be? I have got a great deal of respect for the Botswanan government. I have to say, Ian Khama, God, amazing guy. And their policy was never taken lightly. It was a very well considered idea of what are we going to do? We have this incredible responsibility to some of the most iconic species in the world in our backyard. It is our duty to look after them. How do we do that? How do we do that when we need money to do that? We can ask international governments, international organizations for help, but the responsibility falls to us. So that was the starting point for the Botswanan government anyway. How do we do that? And alongside that, they knew that there were people who would pay a lot of dollars to come and shoot a lion. So how do you marry those two things up? Number one, they're our responsibility, they're in our backyard. Against number two, we really need the money, and this stupid guy is offering to pay us a shed load of money to shoot this poor old lion that's going to pop his clogs next week. How do I marry that up? And in fact, it was pretty much a no-brainer for Botswana. When it came down to it, Joe, it was pretty much a no-brainer. It was a case of, we make sure we know where they are, we direct them where we want them to go, and we control the hunting. Now, just for your questioner, conservation hunting like that is very different from poaching. It's a very, very different thing. I wouldn't ever want to be involved in a commercial hunt like the ones that are permitted in Botswana. The whole thing is abhorrent to me, but it is a very different kind of concept. But I still hate the Trumps, just so you know.
It's a very important question. I think it brings together a lot of the things that we've been speaking about as well. And I guess the other important issue there is then the question of the infrastructure, the local infrastructure in place, so that those funds actually do go and are directed towards the sorts of conservation measures that you are talking about. Because how well can we be assured that that is always the case?
That's a very good point. And actually, this is something that came up not in this year's African Congress, but last year's African Congress, when Zimbabwe made an application to CITES to have their elephants taken off of the register, off the appendix. That exactly was their answer. You know what, we've got shed loads of stockpiled ivory sitting in the corner of the warehouse over there. If we sold that ivory, we can house these people, we can feed these children, we can build this school, we can build this hospital. That was the argument. That was Botswana's argument. Let us sell our stockpiled ivory and we can put it to good use in our own communities. Well, CITES wasn't convinced by that argument.
I think that's a really important point in this model, because we can get sort of distracted by the aspirations, and when you look at the practical application on the ground, it's not always the same picture.
Yeah.
I think this will have to be our final question, and I think it's actually a very interesting one, because it brings us back from the population to the individual. And I think that's always an important question when we're looking at animal welfare. To export a product made of mammoth ivory, does the trader have to prove that the ivory was taken from a particular mammoth? And if so, how to prove it?
When our questioner asks, you see now in my head, I'm seeing Manny from Ice Age. You see Joe, this is the trouble. Did it come from? No, they don't, is the simple answer, so that I'm not too trite about it. No, they don't. They don't actually have to prove that it comes at the moment from a mammoth at all. That would be great if they did have to prove that. And I've told you this afternoon how you can show that. So it's entirely possible, as long as you can see the Schroeder lines, to show that. But no, you don't. And the same applies with elephant ivory. You know, elephants aren't individually catalogued in the range states. So, you know, you don't have one called Sue and one called Karen and one called Marcus. So you can't say, oh, that one came from Marcus. So it's not individualized in that way. Although I love the thought that it should be. I love the thought that it should be.
It's just an interesting point on that to close with. That of course there's a big campaign to well, in historic behavior projects, animal research, the animal subjects were not named. They were numbers now, and it sort of, I think it's really sort of became the norm sort of a couple of decades ago, and it was some Japanese researchers that really propelled this. Animals are named, so animals in research labs, in testing, they have names, and that is interesting. It's not complete, because it shifts the perspective on the animal. So that's why I quite like the question that it's about a particular mammoth.
Yeah.
Because we need to shift our perspective on what is happening with that particular
You're
animal.
quite right, Joe. You're dead right. And I think actually, if we're about to finish, that's the take-home message, isn't it? When you think about elephant ivory and mammoth ivory being used to camouflage something, think about what that creature was when it was alive. This animal was extraordinary. It lived through the harshest winters. My goodness me, you should hear me whine about the cold in the New Forest every winter. This creature survived extraordinary temperatures. It lived through killing by humans. It was hunted by saber-toothed tigers. It had the most amazing history. Think about that. Think about the animal.
Well, I think that's a wonderful message to end on, and thank you so much, Caroline. That was just such a rich discussion, and thank you also to the audience for all the questions. They were wonderful questions. It was a wonderful discussion, and I'm just very grateful to you for sharing this research with us, because I certainly learnt a lot. I've thought about a lot, and I hope, I'm sure the audience also feels the same. So thank you, Caroline, very much indeed. And if I could get everyone to clap, I would. And certainly everyone in the audience, please stay posted. We'll be having lots more animal law roundtables, but for now, please join me in thanking Caroline for an excellent presentation. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks a million, Jo. So much fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank